In the final desperate months of World War II, Allied airmen began reporting encounters with a terrifying new aircraft streaking through the skies of Germany. In one such raid in March 1945, a formation of hundreds of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers lumbered toward their target when, suddenly, a swarm of silvery shapes slashed through them at incredible speed. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," came the alarmed cry on the intercom. But by the time the gunners could swing their turrets, the attackers were already gone in a blur. Explosions blossomed as several bombers fell out of formation, their wings sheared by cannon fire. The stunned crews had just been introduced to the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a technological marvel, flying faster than any Allied plane and bristling with deadly firepower. "Bloody thing's got no props," one British airman shouted incredulously the first time he saw the sleek twin-engine Me 262 flash past his cockpit. This revolutionary fighter, nicknamed Schwalbe, Swallow, by its pilots, seemed like a wonder weapon that could tilt the balance of the air war. Yet, as advanced as it was, the Me 262 had arrived far too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the conflict. This is the remarkable story of Germany's jet, a saga of innovation, ambition, and missed opportunity, unfolding amid the inferno of the Second World War. To understand the significance of the Me 262, we must journey back to the late 1932s, an era when the notion of a jet-powered aircraft was little more than a daring dream. In 1938, as storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, engineers at Messerschmitt began sketching an aircraft that looked like it came from the future. They called the top-secret project Project 1065. The German Air Ministry, Luftwaffe Ministerium, had quietly put out feelers for a high-speed fighter capable of reaching 850 kilometers per hour, 530 miles per hour, and sustaining an hour's flight time, performance impossible for any piston-engine plane of the day. A young aerospace engineer named Waldemar Voigt led Messerschmitt's design team, envisioning a sleek twin-engine fighter that could outrun anything in the sky. By April 1939, months before World War II even began, preliminary designs were on the drawing board. The aircraft was unlike any before it. No propellers, just smooth wings and two strange pods slung underneath to house the new turbojet engines. This was the embryo of the Me 262, yet turning this radical concept into reality would prove agonizingly difficult. The heart of the aircraft, its jet engines, posed a completely new set of engineering challenges. At the time, jet propulsion was cutting-edge technology. Only a handful of people in the world truly understood it. In Britain, inventor Frank Whittle had been experimenting with a jet engine design, and in Germany, a physicist named Hans von Ohain had built one that briefly ran in 1937, but no one had yet made a practical engine powerful and reliable enough for a combat aircraft. Messerschmitt's jet fighter would depend on engines being developed by companies like BMW and Junkers, and progress was slow and plagued by setbacks. Early on, the Messerschmitt design had to be modified to cope with engine problems. The initial plan was to mount the jet engines in the wing roots, the base of the wings, for a sleek look. But as development dragged, the engine prototypes kept coming in heavier than expected. To maintain the plane's balance, engineers made a significant change. They moved the engines outboard into underwing nacelles, the bulbous pods under each wing. It was a practical solution. Not only did it solve some center of gravity issues, it also meant the engines could be serviced or swapped out more easily. That would prove vital later, because early jet engines needed frequent replacement. The designers also gave the wings a subtle sweep, about 18.5 degrees, which was originally just to adjust weight distribution, but incidentally improved the plane's high-speed aerodynamics. This was years before engineers fully understood the benefits of swept wings for fast jets. So in a way, the Me 262 was ahead of its time without even trying to be. As war erupted in 1939 and raged into 1940, the jet fighter remained a secret project, inching along in development. Ironically, the early victories of the Luftwaffe, the rapid conquests in Poland, France, and elsewhere, made some in the German high command complacent. Conventional aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 4 190 were performing well, and resources were tight, so funding and support for exotic new technology was not a priority. In fact, in early 1940, Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring, facing pressures to mass-produce existing fighters, slashed the jet engine research program to a skeleton crew. Germany's leadership simply didn't believe they needed jets to win what they thought would be a short war. This decision nearly doomed the Me 262 before it ever flew, as engine development almost ground to a halt. Nevertheless, a small cadre of engineers persevered. By spring 1941, Messerschmitt had a prototype airframe ready, designated Me 262 V1, but the jet engines still weren't available. Unwilling to wait any longer, the team improvised. They fitted a conventional piston engine in the nose of the aircraft to get it into the air. And so, on 18 April 1941, the Me 262 took to the skies for the very first time, looking like a strange hybrid, a jet plane with a propeller on its nose. Test pilot Fritz Wendel coaxed the plane off the runway, proving the airframe's basic flying qualities. It wasn't the dazzling debut hoped for, but it allowed the engineers to start working out any kinks in the airframe while the jet engines caught up. Finally, in July 1942, the moment of truth arrived. The Me 262 made its first flight powered purely by jets. Two prototype BMW 003 turbojet engines had been fitted under the wings. Fritz Wendel once again sat in the cockpit for this historic flight at Leifheim Airfield. When he opened the throttles, the engines roared with a rather eerie, high-pitched whine unlike any piston engine, and the sleek aircraft hurtled down the runway, only to have both engines fail almost immediately. Wendel managed to nurse the plane into the air using that backup nose propeller, then brought it down safely. It was a shaky start. The culprit was the temperamental BMW engines that simply weren't ready for prime time. It would take another engine type, the Junkers Jumo 004, to truly get the jet program off the ground. The Jumo 004, developed by Dr. Anselm Franz's team at Junkers, became the first production-ready jet engine in the world. By 18 July 1942, a third Me 262 prototype, V3, was equipped with a pair of Jumo 004 engines. This time, no piston backup was needed. The Me 262 thundered into the sky under pure jet power, nearly 9 months before the British managed to fly their first jet. The Gloucester Meteor's initial flight would be in March 1943. For the first time, a true jet fighter plane was flying, and it was German. Test pilot Fritz Wendel was astonished by the performance. The acceleration and speed of the Me 262 were unlike anything he had experienced. But these early flights also revealed new problems. On takeoff, the jet exhaust would bounce off the ground and disrupt the airflow over the plane's tail, making the controls mushy. Wendel discovered he had to tap the brakes at high speed to get the nose up properly, a little quirk of those first prototypes with a tail wheel landing gear. Subsequent test models switched to a more modern tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel to fix that issue, giving the Me 262 a distinctive nose-up stance on the ground. Through 1942 and 1943, the Me 262 test program crept forward, hampered mainly by the infant jet engines. The Jumo 004 engines worked, but they had extremely short lifespans, sometimes only a few hours of runtime before needing serious maintenance or replacement. Part of the problem was materials. The German metallurgists struggled to find alloys that could withstand the intense heat inside the turbojets. Wartime shortages of strategic metals like chromium and nickel meant the engines were built with steel alloys that just couldn't take prolonged punishment. Turbine blades would warp or break, bearings would seize. It was like a high-performance race car engine that would blow after one race. By mid-1943, improved versions of the Jumo 004 could last maybe 50 hours in ideal conditions. But when production was scaled up, quality often suffered, and many engines barely hit 25 hours before failing. The engineers had essentially accepted that the engines would be semi-disposable. While technical challenges were being addressed, events in the war brought a new urgency to the jet project. By 1943, the strategic situation had changed drastically for Germany. The Luftwaffe was now on the defensive. Allied bombing raids were growing in strength, pounding German cities and factories day and night. American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds came by daylight in massive formations, while the Royal Air Force struck by night. The once invincible German fighter force was stretched to the breaking point, trying to stem this tide. Losses were mounting, fuel was becoming scarce, and the Allied air forces only grew stronger. It was precisely the scenario the Me-262 had been envisioned for, a high-speed interceptor to tear through bomber formations and tip the balance back in Germany's favor. Frontline fighter aces like Major Walter Nowotny and Adolf Galland were desperate for any edge to combat the Allied onslaught. Rumors had spread within the Luftwaffe of a wonder fighter in development, a jet that could fly faster than any Mustang or Spitfire. Many veteran pilots were clamoring, when would they finally get this miracle machine? The Me-262's biggest advocate among the Luftwaffe's leadership was General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters. Galland was a fighter ace himself, with over 100 victories, and had even flown a test sortie in a Me-262 in May 1943. Stepping out of the cockpit after that flight, Galland was exhilarated. "What an aircraft! It was as though the angels were pushing," he exclaimed, describing the jet's astounding thrust and speed. He immediately saw the Me-262's potential to shred Allied bombers and pleaded for its rapid introduction. Galland's excitement was shared by others who had glimpsed the jet, but unfortunately not by everyone in power. At the very top, Adolf Hitler had his own ideas about this new airplane. Hitler was certainly intrigued by revolutionary weapons, and when he first witnessed a demonstration of the Me-262 in mid-1943, he was impressed by its speed. However, the Nazi leader fixated on using every new technology not defensively, but offensively. In Hitler's mind, the Me-262's great speed would make it the perfect Schnellbomber, a fast bomber, to strike Allied ground targets and ships. He imagined squadrons of Me-262s swooping down at 800 kilometers per hour to bomb the invading Allied forces should they attempt a landing in France. To him, the jet was less useful as a pure fighter and more as a high-speed strike aircraft that could evade enemy defenses. Thus, in December 1943, Hitler issued a directive. The Me-262 was to be built not as an interceptor, but as a fighter bomber. This order sparked one of the great controversies in aviation history. The aircraft's designers and the Luftwaffe's fighter commanders were dismayed. Converting the Me-262 into a bomber meant fitting it with bomb racks and carrying at least a pair of 250 kilograms, 550 pounds, bombs. That wasn't a huge load, but it required modifications and added weight. The extra weight and drag would reduce the jet's speed and agility, essentially blunting the very edge that made it so special. More importantly, every day spent adapting the Me-262 to drop bombs was a day lost in getting it into service as a desperately needed interceptor. Several high-ranking officers, including Galland, tried to ignore or delay the Führer's decree, hoping to get fighters out to units first. But Hitler eventually discovered their foot-dragging and became furious. The production was reorganized to prioritize a bomber version, designated Me-262A2, a Sturmvogel, Stormbird, which carried bombs and had a slightly reduced armament. Ironically, even as Hitler's meddling slowed the program, another critical bottleneck remained: the engines. By early 1944, the Junkers factories were only just beginning to churn out Jumo 004 engines in quantity. The challenges of mass-producing such advanced power plants were immense. Quality control was poor. Engines arriving at the assembly plants often had to be disassembled and rebuilt. Allied bombing raids complicated matters further by hitting engine factories and material suppliers. The result was that the Me-262, which by now was technically ready for combat, trickled off the assembly lines at a frustratingly slow pace. Nevertheless, April 1944 saw a milestone. The first operational Me-262s were delivered to a service evaluation unit, Airprobungskommando 262, based at Lechfeld in Bavaria. This test and training unit was tasked with working up tactics and training the first group of jet pilots. These initial pilots were hand-picked. Many were experienced fighter veterans chosen to learn the quirks of the jet and then become instructors for others. They found the Me-262 exhilarating to fly, but also challenging. It was unlike any aircraft they had flown before. The cockpit layout was familiar enough, but the view forward was strikingly clear thanks to the tricycle landing gear, no big engine blocking the nose. The power was something else entirely. When the throttles were opened gently, they had to be gentle. Slamming a jet throttle could flame out the engine or even cause a fire. The plane would start rolling and then surge ahead as the twin jets spooled up. On takeoff, the Me-262 needed a longer runway and higher speed than piston fighters because of its higher wing loading and somewhat sluggish engine thrust at low speeds. Landings, too, were much faster. Coming in at over 200 kilometers per hour, the jet was not forgiving of poor technique or short runways. One veteran of the program quipped that transitioning from a propeller fighter to the Me-262 was like going from driving a family car to a race car with a few quirks thrown in. By summer 1944, the war had reached a critical phase. On June 6, the Allies landed in Normandy, France, opening a long-awaited second front in Europe. The Luftwaffe was hard-pressed on all sides, fighting the Soviets in the east, the Western Allies in the skies over France and Germany, and struggling to defend against bombing at home. It was in July 1944 that the Me-262 had its first taste of combat. On 26 July 1944, Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, flying one of the few jets available, encountered a fast British reconnaissance plane, a de Havilland Mosquito, in the skies near Munich. The Mosquito, itself a legendary aircraft known for its speed, suddenly found itself the prey. Schreiber dove on the Mosquito and opened fire with his 430mm Mk108 cannons, unleashing a stream of heavy shells. The Mosquito's pilot, flying officer Albert Wall, dived away desperately. He managed to escape, though his plane was damaged. In fact, Wall returned to base full of bullet holes and minus a hatch cover that had blown off. But he lived to tell the tale of being attacked by a German jet, the first Allied airman to do so. Schreiber was initially credited with a kill because he saw pieces fly off the ground, Mosquito, and assumed it went down, though in reality the British aircraft limped home. Still, the age of jet combat had dawned. Just 2 weeks later, on 8 August 1944, another Me-262 pilot, Lieutenant Joachim Weber, fired on and destroyed an RAF Mosquito, scoring what is generally regarded as the first official air-to-air kill by a jet fighter. Soon after, the jets drew blood against the heavy bombers. Feldwebel Helmut Lenartz shot down an American B-17 bomber in mid-August 1944, marking the first bomber kill for the Me-262. The men flying the Flying Fortresses were shocked. They were accustomed to German interceptors like 4190S or Bf-109S making slashing gun passes at them. But those came in slowly enough that the bomber gunners could fight back and at least brace for the attack. With the Me-262, the warning was often nothing more than a streak in the corner of the eye, followed by cannons thudding and a B-17 exploding. By the fall of 1944, Germany's jet units were growing, but still in a testing phase. A special trials and tactics unit led by the ace Walter Nowotny, dubbed Commando Nowotny, operated a handful of Me-262S to evaluate them in frontline conditions. Now Watney's jets, flying from airfields in northwestern Germany, engaged Allied bombers and their escorts in several skirmishes. They found the Me-262 to be devastatingly fast, so fast in fact that it posed new problems. During one head-on pass at American bombers, a Me-262 closed the distance so rapidly that the pilot had mere seconds to fire before zipping past the formation. Traditional gunnery methods had to be thrown out. New tactics were devised to make use of the jet's speed while still allowing time to aim and shoot. One approach the Me-262 pilots developed was a kind of roller coaster attack. The jet would position itself high above and well behind a bomber stream, virtually invisible to the bomber crews. Then it would dive at an angle, picking up tremendous speed, often approaching 850 kilometers per hour. It would slice through or beneath the escorting Allied fighters too quickly for them to react. As the Me-262 got near the bombers, the pilot would pull up sharply, bleeding off speed. Done right, this left the jet about 500 meters behind a bomber, flying a bit faster than the formation, but not so fast as to overshoot instantly. In that brief window, often only a second or two of steady aim, the pilot would unleash the cannons, each firing shells the size of wine bottles. Just a few hits from the 4 Mk108 cannons could rip a B-17 apart or set its engines ablaze. After the firing pass, the jet would dive away and zoom back up to set up another attack or escape. Another innovation to help the Me-262 kill bombers was the use of R-4M rockets. German engineers loaded some Me-262S with racks of tiny, unguided air-to-air rockets, 24 per aircraft, 12 under each wing. These rockets, fired in salvos, packed a mighty punch. In theory, a jet could volley a dozen or two rockets into a bomber formation from a few hundred meters away, where even a near miss could shred a big plane. One or two rocket hits could down even the tough Flying Fortress. By approaching from the side of a formation, presenting a wide target, and unleashing rockets, the Me-262S hoped to devastate the bomber groups. This tactic did prove effective when tried, but it was introduced in only the last weeks of the war, and only a small number of jets were outfitted with the rocket racks. Had it come earlier, the already nightmare problem of jet interceptors would have been even more lethal for Allied bomber crews. Despite these successes in the air, the Me-262S faced overwhelming obstacles. One of the greatest was simply numbers. The Nazi leadership had prioritized the jet far too late, and in too haphazard a fashion. Although an impressive 1,400-plus Me-262 airframes were built by war's end, many never received engines or proper testing. In fact, only around 200 to 300 Me-262S ever saw combat. At any given time, the number of jets ready to fly was a fraction of that. The rest sat in various stages of assembly or repair, starved of fuel, spare parts, or threatened by air raids. To put this in perspective, on a typical day in early 1945, the Western Allies could send over 1,000 bombers and 1,000 escorting fighters on a single mission, while the Luftwaffe struggled to gather a few dozen operational jets to oppose them. Even on the Me-262's most celebrated day, 18 March 1945, when about 37 Me-262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 attacked an Allied bomber formation, they could only dent the Allied armada. Those 37 jets managed to shoot down 12 bombers and 1 fighter for the loss of only 3 jets. It was a remarkable kill ratio in any other context, but 12 bombers out of 1,200 is just 1% of the attacking force. The raid went on undeterred to blast its targets. For the Allies, the presence of jets was terrifying on a personal level. Many a bomber crewman watched a jet flash by and felt utterly helpless. But strategically, there were never enough Me-262s to turn the tide. Allied pilots quickly adapted their tactics to counter the jet threat. They learned that trying to dogfight a Me-262 in mid-air was usually futile. The German jet could simply speed away from any troublesome situation. But the jets had vulnerabilities. Their engines were sluggish at low speeds and could be temperamental. During takeoff and landing, a jet was an easy target, moving relatively slowly, low to the ground, with engines that didn't respond quickly if the pilot needed to suddenly accelerate. Allied fighter units began stalking known Me-262 airfields, lurking high above and then diving down when jets were taking off, or even better, when they were coming in to land with nearly empty fuel tanks. This tactic proved effective, but was perilous as well. Those airfields became heavily defended, flak alleys, ringed, with anti-aircraft guns that filled the sky with exploding shells whenever Allied fighters neared. One famous Allied pilot, Captain Chuck Yeager of the USAAF, scored one of the first American victories over a Me-262 using exactly these methods. In October 1944, Yeager spotted an Me-262 preparing to land. He dove after it at high speed. The German pilot, focused on his landing approach, had little chance. Yeager's P-51 Mustang closed in and opened fire, hitting the jet which crash-landed just short of the airfield. Later, with his trademark swagger, Yeager would say, "The first time I ever saw a jet, I shot it down." Many other Allied aces would replicate the feat in subsequent months, not engaging the jets in swirling dogfights, but catching them at their most vulnerable moments. The British, too, found ways to fight the Me-262. They fielded a superb late-war fighter, the Hawker Tempest, which had excellent low-altitude speed. Tempest pilots would perform what they called rat scrambles. As soon as radar or observers reported a jet airborne, Tempests on standby would launch and race toward the jet's last known location, particularly focusing on the jet bases in northern Germany and the Netherlands. Rather than chase the nimble jet in the air, which was often pointless if the jet pilot kept his speed up, the Tempests would arrive over the German airfield, right around the time the Me-262 needed to land, and attempt to ambush it on approach. This cat-and-mouse game led the Germans to further respond by stationing their own top-of-the-line 4-190D9 and TAR-152 fighters to cover the jets during takeoff and landing, and by laying out formidable flak batteries near the runways. In one instance, a cluster of Tempests bounced a jet coming in to land at Rheinhopsten airfield, only to fly into a withering curtain of flak. Several British fighters were shot down by ground fire in seconds. After losing several pilots this way, the rat scramble tactic was tempered, but the basic principle remained. The Allies would hit the jets where and when they were weakest. While intense duels played out in the skies, many Me-262s met their end in more mundane ways: lack of fuel, mechanical breakdowns, or accidents. Germany, by late 1944, was starved of oil. Synthetic fuel production was decimated by bombing. Jet engines gulped fuel voraciously. The Me-262's thirst was roughly double that of a twin-engine piston plane. As Allied attacks targeted oil plants and fuel convoys, the Luftwaffe often couldn't get enough jet fuel, a special high-grade kerosene called J2, to even fly training missions. Some newly trained Me-262 pilots went into combat with barely a few hours of total flight time in the jet. They had never even fired the guns or practiced air combat in it. This led to disastrous losses from crashes and mishandling. The Me-262 was not a forgiving aircraft to a novice. It landed hot and could easily overshoot runways or blow a tire. If a pilot panicked on approach and cut the throttles too fast, the engines might flame out, turning the sleek fighter into a deadweight glider. Numerous jets were wrecked in landing accidents or takeoff crashes before seeing any combat. However, in the hands of skilled pilots, the Me-262 proved a formidable foe. Several German aces achieved significant success flying the jet. Johannes Steinhoff, a seasoned ace, recalled initially struggling to engage nimble Allied fighters because the Me-262's speed made them seem to float like a sack of fleas in front of him. He would zip past before getting a proper shot. But pilots soon adjusted their tactics and learned to use the jet's strengths. Men like Franz Schall, who downed 17 enemies in the Me-262, and Georg Peter Eder, with at least a dozen kills in the jet, became adept at high-speed combat. Perhaps the highest scorer in the Me-262 was Kurt Welter, who claimed around 25 victories, many of Kurt Welter, and them in hazardous night fighter missions against British Mosquito bombers. Welter operated a few two-seat Me-262s, outfitted with primitive radar for night interceptions, prowling the darkness for RAF Pathfinder Mosquitoes. It's debated how many he actually shot down at night, but he was undoubtedly one of the innovators of jet night fighting. Another famed ace, Heinrich Heinz Beer, transitioned to the Me-262 late in the war and was credited with 16 kills in the jet, adding to an awe-inspiring 220+ in prop planes earlier. Beer and others found that, contrary to initial worries, the Me-262 could dogfight if needed. It wasn't the lumbering straight-line rocket that some assumed. Thanks to automatic leading-edge slats, a feature Messerschmitt had used on their Bf-109, the Me-262's wings could generate extra lift at low speeds, meaning it could turn tighter than expected without stalling. And without a propeller, the jet could dive without the fear of propeller-driven aerodynamic limits. Moreover, jet engines didn't lose power at high altitudes like piston engines did, so the Me-262 retained excellent performance even up high where bombers cruised. All this meant that an Me-262, if it avoided slow-speed cornering fights, could dictate the terms of an engagement, zooming in, striking, and zooming away to set up another attack. Allied pilots noted that as long as the German jet pilot kept his speed up, it was almost impossible to catch him. The Me-262 could outrun the famous North American P-51 Mustang by over 150 kilometers per hour, 90 miles per hour. This speed margin was like bringing a rifle to a knife fight. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Luftwaffe organized dedicated all-jet units. Jagdgeschwader 7, JG-7, Nowotny, became the world's first jet fighter wing. It eventually fielded several dozen Me-262s and was responsible for most of the jet victories in the final phase of the war. Another unit, Jagdverband 44, JV-44, was formed in February 1945, led by none other than Adolf Galland, who had fallen out of favor with Goering and was relieved of his command of all fighters. Galland convinced higher-ups to let him form a small elite squadron of Me 262s. JV-44 attracted some of the Luftwaffe's most legendary aces, men like Gerhard Barkhorn and Walter Krupinski, eager to fly the new jet. They painted the bottom of their accompanying FW-190D escort planes in bright red with white stripes, earning those escorts the nickname Papagei Staffel, or Parrot Squadron, to ensure ground defenses recognized them as friendly when they protected the jets on takeoff and landing. Galland himself, despite a knee injury from a crash, flew combat in the Me 262 and scored several kills in the final weeks of the war. One of the most dramatic encounters came in April 1945, when Galland's Me 262 was engaged by American fighters. Galland led a sortie against Allied bombers and used his Me 262's rockets and cannons to down a B-26 Marauder bomber. But as he lined up on another target, an American P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 50th Fighter Group, dived on Galland's jet. Finnegan's .50 caliber bullets tore into the Me 262, shattering its instrument panel and wounding Galland in the leg. With one engine dead and his canopy shot up, Galland had to bail out of the fight. He managed to nurse his crippled jet back toward a nearby airfield and crash-landed. Galland survived and later recounted how he nearly decided to jump, but feared being shot in his parachute by vengeful Allied fighters, a fate that had befallen some German pilots. Instead, he skidded the jet along the field, pulled himself from the wreckage, and literally limped away as explosions from attacking Allied aircraft rocked the area. It was a bitter episode. One of Germany's greatest pilots, flying its most advanced fighter, brought down by the overwhelming numbers and constant pressure of the Allied air forces. As April turned to May 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, yet remarkably, the Me 262 units kept fighting until the very end. In the last days of April, with Soviet troops encircling Berlin, some Me 262s were thrown into ground attack missions in a desperate attempt to support the beleaguered German army. Jets from JG-7 strafed Soviet columns, destroying a handful of vehicles and even shooting down a few Soviet ground attack planes like the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. But these missions were costly. Flying low and straight to strafe made the jets easy targets for Soviet flak and fighters. Several were shot down, and each loss was irreplaceable. On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended with Germany's surrender. That very afternoon, an Me 262 pilot scored what is believed to be the last Luftwaffe aerial victory of World War II. Lieutenant Fritz Stahl of JG-7 was aloft in his Me 262 when he spotted a group of Soviet planes. With one final burst of his cannons, he took down a Soviet fighter. Reports suggest it was likely an American-built P-39 Airacobra in Soviet service. Hours later, all German aircraft were grounded for good. The jet age had begun, but too late to save its creators. In the aftermath of surrender, the Allied powers scrambled to seize examples of the Me 262 and the associated jet technology. Teams of American, British, and Soviet engineers were eager to examine the revolutionary aircraft. Several Me 262s were found intact on German airfields, and some German pilots even delivered jets to the Allies. One test pilot, for instance, defected by flying his Me 262 to an Allied airstrip, presenting the plane like a gift from the heavens, though perhaps more like a white elephant, given its engine maintenance needs. The Allied test pilots who got to fly the Me 262 after the war came away impressed. Britain's celebrated test pilot Captain Eric Winkle Brown flew a captured Me 262 and noted its phenomenal speed and decent handling. He did observe, however, its problematic lack of air brakes, something that could have made its high-speed attacks easier to control, as German pilots had lamented. The Me-262 directly influenced post-war aircraft development. The United States and the Soviet Union had their own jet projects underway by 1944, but the Me-262 provided invaluable data and lessons. The Americans brought several Me-262s back to the US under Operation Lusty and test flew them extensively. The famous American jet fighter of the early 1952s, the F-86 Sabre, owed a debt to the Me-262, not in exact design, but concepts like wing sweep. The Sabre's designers consulted German research on swept wings, which engineers like Adolf Bussmann had pioneered and even proposed for future Me-262 variants. The Soviets likewise gleaned insight that fed into their MiG-15 fighter. Even the British Meteor, while developed independently, benefited from comparing notes with the German jet. For a brief period after the war, the only nation to actually operate Me-262s in military service, aside from defeated Germany, was Czechoslovakia. The Czechs had inherited a few airframes and parts left at German factories on their soil. In 1946-47, they assembled a handful of Me-262s, known as Avia S-92 and CS-92 for the trainer version, and even flew them in their nascent air force. But by 1951, these jets were retired as newer designs from the Soviet Union became available. The Me-262's combat career, which had begun with such fanfare, ended quietly in a corner of Eastern Europe a few years after the war. Yet, the legacy of the Me-262 is profound. It was, without question, a pioneering aircraft, the harbinger of a new age in warfare. In design it was elegant, twin engines, swept wings, a sleek fuselage that still looks modern. In capability, it proved that jet propulsion was a game-changer. After the Me-262, no major air force could ignore the jet. Piston-engine fighters were suddenly obsolete, as quaint as biplanes had become a decade before. One can draw a line from the Me-262 to every jet fighter that followed, from the Sabres and MiGs that dueled over Korea to the supersonic aircraft of the late 20th century. Pieces of the Me-262's DNA, its concepts and innovations, live on in those machines. However, the Me-262 also stands as a cautionary tale of military innovation, misused and mistimed. In Nazi propaganda, the Me-262 was briefly trumpeted as one of those wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But no miracle came. The jet was simply introduced too late, in too chaotic and resource-starved a context, to make more than a pinprick of difference. If anything, Germany's gamble on late-war superweapons like the Me-262 V2 rockets and others drained resources from more practical defenses. By 1944, even if the Luftwaffe had received 1,000 Me-262s, it lacked the fuel and trained pilots to use them effectively. The leadership failures, from not prioritizing engine development early on to Hitler's misdirection of the jet's role, sealed the aircraft's fate as a could-have-been. Looking back, one can't help but imagine hypothetical scenarios. What if the Me-262 had appeared en masse in 1943? Could it have blunted the Allied bombing offensive, perhaps delaying D-Day? Some German aces like Galland later mused that if only 300 Me-262s had been deployed to cover Normandy, the Allied invasion air cover might have been nullified. These are intriguing what-ifs, but history dealt a different hand. By the time Me-262s were shooting down dozens of bombers, Germany's cities were already in ruins and its armies in retreat. Today, the Me-262 holds a special fascination for aviation enthusiasts and historians. A number of the original aircraft survive in museums around the world, their sleek shark-like forms still imposing up close. In recent years, a few engineers and enthusiasts even built flying reproductions of the Me 262, using modern engines fitted inside replicas of the original airframe. Watching one of these reproductions in flight is as close as one can get to witnessing the eerie whine and blistering speed of the original Swallow in its element. It serves as a living reminder of the brief period when this aircraft soared as the fastest thing in the sky. In sum, the Messerschmitt Me 262 was an extraordinary feat of engineering, born in an extraordinary time. It was the right plane for a wrong moment, a machine that could have been a triumph had it come earlier and under better guidance, but instead became an example of too little, too late. Its legacy is twofold. On one hand, it undeniably ushered in the jet age, demonstrating the superiority of jet fighters and shaping the design of virtually every military aircraft that followed. On the other hand, it remains a symbol of the German war effort's last convulsions. Brilliant technical achievements, unable to stave off inevitable defeat. As a narrative coder, we return to that spring day in 1945 where we began. Imagine a weary American bomber gunner scanning the sky. He knows the war is almost won. Rumors say the enemy is on its last legs. Yet up here, in the freezing, flak-filled skies, death can still strike out of the blue. Suddenly, his eyes catch a glint. Something is coming in fast. There's no engine roar audible, just an otherworldly shriek as the object closes in. He glimpses the swept wings, the lack of propellers, and his blood runs cold. He swings his turret frantically to track it. In a flash, the jet darts through the formation. The gunner's plane shudders as cannon shells tear into a neighboring B-17, which erupts in flames. The jet climbs away with effortless grace, almost like a predator playing with its prey. It is gone as quickly as it appeared. That gunner survived the war, and perhaps years later he learned what it was that had attacked them, the Me 262, the Stormbird that arrived too late to matter in 1945. But in that heartbeat of terror, he had seen the future of flight take wing, and indeed, the world of aviation would never be the same again.